Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's October 30th, 2025. Jeff and I are going to have a little bit of a friendly and not particularly formal debate about the unanswered or answered questions regarding the Charlie Kirk death and the fallout from it. But before that, I want to add a little bit of an addendum to the recording last week, specifically with regards to the Patriot polling poll that found in the New York City mayoral race that Mamdani was dominating among foreign-born New Yorkers, winning 62% to Cuomo's 24% and Curtis Sliwa's 12%. And the based immigrants question came to my mind because even those who are on the outskirts of acceptable opinion with regards to the national question and identitarianism, like myself, still have many examples of the hilarious and sympathetic based immigrants, the proverbial rooftop Korean, the Malik Obamas, that is Barack Obama's uncle, who is way more based and red-pilled than the average Breitbart reader is, or the niece of Osama bin Laden. There are many examples of non-heritage Americans of essentially being more heritage American than heritage Americans are willing to be. And there is naturally some sympathy that is elicited by how they act, and it is not an insignificant amount. And this is kind of a long-winded way of pointing out that Curtis Sliwa winning 12% of the foreign-born population in New York City of 3 million, that's 1 in 8 of those 3 million. And if you extrapolate that nationally in a country where between 10 and 15% of the population is foreign-born, that is somewhere in the rough range of 40 million to 80 million foreign-born residents currently residing in the United States. And if 1 in 8 of them are that rooftop Korean-based sort of foreign-born, more heritage American than heritage America, well, that comes to somewhere on the order of 5 or 10 million people. There are a lot of people like that. And yet still, if you want to have a country that is recognizable and that is for ourselves and our posterity, then that cannot be, those individual examples cannot overrule the reality that in a lot of ways quantity has a quality of its own, and it is more palatable, instead of getting hooked on those examples and putting too much effort, too much emphasis on them, that it is more palatable to simply call for an immigration moratorium.
Moving to our main topic, the Charlie Kirk killing, which occurred on September 10th, 2025. I think we'll start by listing what we agree on, which is that indeed on September 10th in the afternoon at Utah Valley University, Charlie Kirk was killed, and we both believe killed by a firearm. Is that your working assumption, Ness?
Yes.
Let's lay out the official narrative in broad strokes. So it is a lone shooter, Tyler Robinson. He is from a conservative Mormon household, and he at some point in his young adult life moved away from his parents' MAGA beliefs and became immersed in online culture and became a furry and was or still is in a relationship with a man who's a transgender man, and that he was so appalled by the anti-trans rhetoric that Charlie Kirk espoused that motivated him to assassinate Charlie Kirk on September 10th, and he was radicalized online and he acted alone. He climbed up onto the rooftop during the Turning Point event and shot Charlie Kirk dead. So I think we'll start. Let's start by talking about maybe what we both agree is suspicious and needs more explanation. So maybe some areas of agreement first.
Yeah, I don't think there's any value in burying the lead. The most questionable, the most compelling piece of evidence that the official narrative is incorrect. And I will invoke my working assumption here. I'll invoke Vox Dei's adage that even though we often don't know exactly what the truth is, we can rest assured that whatever the officially reported narrative is, that it is incorrect. And the most compelling reason that it is incorrect is that the idea that a high-powered rifle, unobstructed from hundreds of yards away, would hit a human in the neck and puncture an artery but not exit out the back, when high-powered rifles like these can literally go through multiple moose bodies for the longest diameter of moose bodies, enter and then come out the other side. That is what happened. And the official explanation is that it was just a miracle, that apparently Charlie Kirk's bones were Superman caliber, stronger than steel, and they were able to stop this single bullet from leaving any sort of exit wound. That is what seems to be a pretty open and shut case, that the idea that it was a single high-powered rifle shot that hit and killed Kirk is not correct.
I'm completely outside my depth on any sort of firearm knowledge or knowledge of ballistics, but my understanding is that from that distance with that gun, it is more likely than not, very high likelihood that there would be an exit wound. And so the fact that there's not is very suspicious. However, I'm not sure it's impossible that at the right angle from that far away, with any obstructions along the way, that I think it's possible that there would not be an exit wound.
It's also mentioned in the officially reported narrative that there were multiple shell casings found with various convenient, memeable internet jargon on them, on the shell casings.
Such as catch fascist.
Yes, but there were multiple. I don't recall them all off the top of my head, but you can pull news stories from the hours and first few days after the story to see the multiple casings found, reported on, and yet the official story is that it was only a single bullet that hit Kirk and there were no other shots fired. And so why there were multiple shell casings if there was only a single bullet and therefore should have only been a single shell is an open question that wasn't really ever answered, and now it's just not talked about anymore.
So the implication then is that if he had fired from a high-powered rifle, that there would be an exit wound. The fact that there wasn't an exit wound, what do you think that indicates then? How was Charlie Kirk killed?
A close-range pistol shot or some sort of other projectile launched from closer range with lower velocity would certainly be able to create an entry wound and puncture an artery. A butter knife can puncture an artery, but would not have the force to go through several inches of skin and sinew and then come out of the back.
I'm just trying to figure out how logistically that would have worked, because we have an exact time, some 12-something p.m. on September 10th when Charlie Kirk was killed, and that is somebody was on the roof, and Tyler Robinson, I don't think you're disagreeing that Tyler Robinson was there. So do you think that he even fired? Did he even fire from the rifle from the rooftop at all?
Well, I don't know. There is a more of a meta point here that there's a big asymmetry in information, and I think it is an impossible ask to inquire or require that those skeptical of the official narrative give a definitive alternative that is as airtight as we expect the official narrative to be.
I'm not asking for a definitive. I guess I'm just asking to imagine. You can, whatever plausible scenario you want to come up with, given the facts that we know and that I don't think we're disputing, that Tyler Robinson was present at the time and place we're talking about, what could be an explanation, an alternative explanation, if he was not the one who killed Charlie Kirk?
That he was part of the plot, and I can spin a plausible conception in my head that he was part of the plot and he didn't know the entirety of the plot. That is often the case with these sort of intelligence actions. In fact, that is standard. It is not the exception that proves the rule. It is the rule that you have multiple people involved and each person knows very little about the total operation, because that's just basic OPSEC operational security protocols, so that even if people did want to come clean and reveal the entire plot, they can't do it. At most, they can just say that they were told to do this one little part and that it seemed weird, or they can try to piece it together afterwards, but they're far less of a liability to the operation if they don't know the entire story. So in the case of Tyler Robinson, it could be he's in some sort of Antifa type of network that also has connections to NGOs and the alphabet agencies, sort of the shadowy deep state. And his task was to take this to go up on a roof, potentially take a rifle, or place the rifle there afterward or beforehand rather than afterwards. We'll probably talk about the video that you can see on the Wikipedia page for the event that shows him, allegedly Tyler Robinson, hopping off the roof and then running across a busy street and having to wait for vehicles to pass before he can cross the street. And if the official narrative is what it is, then at that point in time, he has the rifle with him. It's hard to see on with the naked eye that he has a full-length, high-powered rifle that he's carrying as he jumps off a building several feet and then lands. If he has it, he's concealing it quite well, and he is confident enough to somewhat nonchalantly, he kind of jogs at first, but then he walks when he gets close to other vehicles holding a rifle, that he then crosses a busy street and at some point later drops the rifle off, seemingly inexplicably. If he's made it that far carrying a rifle, why would he drop it off? Why not just continue to his vehicle and then get in his vehicle and drive somewhere really far away and dispose of it then? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, it is probably unfair to presume that somebody who engaged in one of the highest profile assassinations in American history, who had just done that, to be thinking entirely rationally. But it is plausible too that Tyler Robinson's job was to just be up on the roof at a certain time and maybe beforehand place the rifle in a specific place to later be found and then identified as the putative murder weapon. And that Tyler Robinson could have played that role without actually ever pulling the trigger or even necessarily having a rifle when he was on the roof, because it seems like his ability to move would be hindered by having to carry a rifle, whereas if he just is clad in black on a roof and hops down afterwards and then nonchalantly goes on his way, then he is less likely to be stopped by citizens who are there organically as this chaos is all playing out.
I think if he had shot him, it makes sense that he would want to get rid of the gun as soon as possible. And I could imagine that he scoped the place out before, and he had a place that he was going to drop the weapon to escape the chaos. And then that means that obviously he's going to arouse a lot less suspicion walking around without a gun versus trying to hold a rifle. So to me, and I'm sure the police were swarming soon thereafter after the shot was fired. So he didn't want to get stopped with the gun. So he had a place nearby he could get rid of it and then come back later once things had died down a bit, pick up the weapon. That all makes sense to me. Why not just, if he was in a position on the rooftop to take the shot and they had a good patsy and they had all the story, like why would they go to all the trouble of getting whoever's orchestrating this? Why would they go to all the trouble of getting Robinson up on the roof and then not have him actually shoot Charlie Kirk? Why not just, if their goal was to kill Charlie Kirk, why would they not just have Robinson do it? Why did they need this, in my opinion, kind of convoluted plan? What benefit does that have rather than just have Robinson fire the shot?
Well, for one thing, you have to have a willing person who is going to fire the shot and commit the murder. And it's not exactly like the movies where you have a guaranteed kill from a rooftop position like that. We can turn to the Butler example, Donald Trump, assuming for the sake of argument that official narrative as reported is voracious. Well, if that is the case, there's a perfect example of how you can't guarantee that you're going to hit your mark if you're firing from several hundred yards away. But if you have that as the person to finger afterwards, then you can have a nice, tidy story that you can wrap up, and you can publicly place the blame on this person that nobody really knows anything about and who was probably told that he is going to have to risk doing something for the cause, because if not everyone's free, then no one's free, and this is the way you're going to contribute, and don't worry, your life is not going to be ruined. It's going to be stressful for you, but you're going to come out of this on the other side okay, whatever exactly that means. And you can guarantee that if that is the plot that you're pulling off, that you at a closer range, with a closer range projectile, you can guarantee that you hit your mark. And so in the case of Trump, there is the adage about if you take a shot at the king, you better not miss. And for better or worse, that isn't actually how Trump operates. And in the case of Charlie Kirk, who knows exactly? He was, I think there is a lot of evidence that he was beginning to say and think and write and ask a lot of questions. And he had a lot of salience, one of the best known, most influential people in the American political scene on the right, broadly defined, that if you took a shot at Charlie Kirk and missed, then he might have totally opened up, and it really could be potentially world changing. And so the calculation would be that even if you could find someone who was really willing to kamikaze sacrifice themselves and actually kill him and take the fall for it, even if you could get somebody to do that, and that's a much bigger ask than somebody like Tyler Robinson being told that he's playing a role, but that he's not actually going to be asked to kill anybody. That's a lot easier psychological ask. And you also don't have to worry about the fact that the potential that you could miss.
But it sounds like you are accepting that Charlie Kirk was killed by a firearm. And I'm also, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also presuming that because there was no exit wound, it was shot at relatively short range with some sort of handgun, like a pistol or something like that. Is that your assumption?
Yeah, I think it would be something that has a much shorter projectile range, a smaller tube, and therefore less force from a closer angle. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a firearm. When there's a famous example relatively recently in international news of several pager devices going off and releasing projectiles that killed people who were in close vicinity. And so it wouldn't necessarily have to be a pistol. It could be something smaller than that. It could be conceivably some 3D printed object that is just inches in diameter. It could be very easily concealed in a crowd at close range.
If this case goes to trial, presumably all of these things, well, hopefully some of these things at least will be addressed, and that they'll have some sort of ballistics expert, and that both sides will give their explanation for how Charlie Kirk was killed. So why don't we move on? Let's discuss possible motives. So when I first heard about the killing, my thought was, well, the question I think is very valuable to ask in situations like this is cui bono, or who benefits. So if you're trying to figure out what happened in a situation like this, a good place to start would be, well, who benefits from Charlie Kirk being killed? And my first thought was the Zionists, because Charlie Kirk, there's strong evidence that Charlie Kirk was at the very least questioning his ironclad support for the state of Israel, and he was being pressured greatly by Jewish interests, and he was discouraged from engaging with people like Tucker Carlson, who's also moving away from reflexive support of everything Israel does. And we've discussed on previous episodes how much less support there is for Israel among young people. Even among young right-wing white people, the support for Israel is much less than for older people and boomers. And it's essentially like the older you get in generations in America, the stronger your support for Israel goes. And Charlie Kirk had enormous influence on a lot of people, but particularly young men. And so if he was starting to turn against Israel, he would presumably be a Pied Piper and might lead, accelerate the trend away from supporting Israel. So it seems to me like Zionists would have the biggest motivation to assassinate Charlie Kirk. But I try to be rational and empirical as much as I can, and I just don't see any legitimate empirical evidence that Israel had anything to do with killing Charlie Kirk. But Ness, who do you think, or who are some entities that would benefit from Charlie Kirk being killed, and who are they, and what benefits would there be?
All of the remaining leadership structure in Turning Point USA, the MAGA movement, the second Trump administration, the military-industrial complex, the Likud party, the State of Israel, the TradCon, officially sanctioned movement of evangelical Christian Zionists. I think the list goes on and on of the people who benefit from Charlie Kirk being martyred in this way.
There certainly has been several groups and people who have attempted to come in and claim the Charlie Kirk legacy. The Zionists, as I said, because it appears that Charlie Kirk, it appears like he was at the beginning of, and I'm speculating here, but it seemed to me like he was at the beginning of a trajectory moving towards a true America First perspective, meaning that America comes before Israel. And so he was early enough on in that trajectory where him being killed, you could still plausibly, the pro-Israel Zionists could still plausibly claim Charlie Kirk as one of their own, and therefore by carrying on Charlie Kirk's legacy, that means continuing rock-solid support for Israel.
Yes, this is why you're asking the cui bono question. Most especially the Zionist cause benefits from this, because nothing is more harmful to a cause than the zealousy of a recent apostate, and that was the trajectory that Charlie Kirk was on. And so they were able to see where that was going and intercept it and snuff it out, and now have been able to effectively retcon the little bit of questioning that did get out there and scream that anything having to do, any assumptions made about the direction of the trajectory that Jeff is talking about that Charlie Kirk was on, that is all conspiratorial and anti-Semitic and on, and so they are able to create the ultimate martyr in Charlie Kirk for a cause that he, it seems, was on the road to rejecting. And this is not dissimilar to the other high-profile assassinations that this has been understandably compared to, like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, who was well established as a civil rights champion, but what he had begun to do before he was killed was he began to turn on the military-industrial state and the wars of American colonialism, and that is when he was killed, and then you never heard anything else about that trajectory that he was on, and instead you get a day of celebration of him and his emphasis on the things that he cared about before, which were the civil rights crusade.
And in terms of claiming Charlie Kirk's legacy, I think another key uncontroversial aspect of his legacy was free speech. His whole shtick, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I guess I should say his whole approach was to go into hostile territory and engage with people who disagreed with him in a good faith discussion and try to reach common ground and convince people of the correctness of his views. And so with that legacy of free speech, you would think that, for instance, this week, Tucker Carlson sitting down with a 2-hour interview with Nick Fuentes, that would be right in line with the legacy of Charlie Kirk, of engaging with people even if you don't agree with their viewpoints. But many of the Zionist supposedly supporters of Charlie Kirk are now, like Dinesh D'Souza just leaked some text messages that Charlie Kirk supposedly sent, calling Nick Fuentes scum. And so there is, I guess, a tension there between Charlie Kirk's trying to claim Charlie Kirk for Zionist ends, that he was a Zionist, and therefore to continue Charlie Kirk's legacy, you have to continue to support Israel. On the other hand, if you want to embrace Charlie Kirk's legacy, you also have to engage in free speech. But what if that free speech is counter to furthering the ends of Zionism? And I think that's why that you see this contradiction and this tension in people trying to shut Tucker Carlson down. It's not so easy to do because it was also very clear that Charlie Kirk supported Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, I think I rock what you're getting at there, but you are probably being too charitable to the Zionists that want to use Charlie Kirk's legacy to continue the right side American support for what Israel is doing in the Middle East and elsewhere, that just because they want to utilize that part of his legacy to benefit themselves does not mean that they also want to use his legacy for free expression, free speech, open dialogue, that they have any interest in that whatsoever. And so instead of focusing on Charlie Kirk's willingness, presumably, to debate with Nick Fuentes, although I think he refused that, at least earlier in his career, he did engage with a lot of Nick Fuentes' Groyper followers in open discussion. But instead of putting emphasis on that, if you are the MAGA, Zionist cause, if you are that force, you just don't put emphasis on that, and instead you use Charlie Kirk's animosity, acrimony towards Nick Fuentes or to anyone else who, Candace Owens, they tried, despite the fact that Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens came up together and largely built Turning Point USA together. The stories reported in the weeks after Charlie Kirk's death is that they hadn't talked to each other and that they had a falling out and they had become enemies. And so you can use Charlie Kirk's legacy in any scuffles, any disagreements he had, real or imagined, with your opponents. You can use his personal invective that was directed towards those individuals to try to discredit them, while simultaneously using his long-established but increasingly precarious support for Israel. You can use that to continue the Zionist cause. So I think I get what you're getting at, but I don't think that just because they're going to utilize some aspect of his legacy that is grounded in truth doesn't mean they will totally invert another aspect of his legacy to try to use to further their own ends, even if it doesn't at all mesh up and never did really mesh up with what Charlie Kirk actually believed. And I realize that what I'm offering is conjecture, and I don't think that there is any reason not to separate questions from or questions about the official narrative and then speculation on what might have actually happened, because that is just total conjecture on my part, and I wouldn't put money on that in the same way that I would put money on the official story being incorrect. I don't know exactly what happened. I'm not even close to what actually happened. I feel as confident as I can from the distance from the events and the way that they're filtered, as confident as I can that the official single shooter narrative seems incorrect. But the reason that I think it is important to put so much pressure on this is because this is the same sort of pattern that plays out again and again and again. I see parallels with the Iraq War here. If we this analogy might seem stretched, but I think the principle exists, and there's a through line on the principle between both of these events. When it came to the alleged weapons of mass destruction that the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein had in the lead up to the Iraq War, there was all of this evidence presented that could not be dispositively disproved at the time. And so there were some people who had the bloodlust and wanted to attack Iraq, but there were a lot of other people who felt, while they were not naturally disposed to American-led military action on the other side of the globe, they saw the evidence and couldn't positively disprove it, and gave some level of credulity to what was presented by top military brass at the United Nations. And the Iraq War happened, and most people supported it. And then over time, it was revealed that all the evidence was total BS, but no one who spun the false narrative ended up being punished for it. And all the events that the power centers that pushed the Iraq War, everything that they wanted to get out of it, they got out of it. And then in the future, more and more people saw that it was false, and now it is generally believed almost universally that the entire pretext of the Iraq War was built on a lie, and yet the managerial state, the neoliberal order, got everything that it wanted out of that, notwithstanding the way that it played out once the war occurred and the difficulties in creating a stable Western colonial presence in Iraq. That's separate, but in terms of being able to execute everything that the state wanted to do in Iraq and toppling the Saddam Hussein regime on a totally fabricated set of reasons for why it was done, by the time that was all discovered and effectively dispositively proved to be false, the damage had already been done. And you can see similar parallels in the whole story of COVID, first with the lab leak theory, and then the funding, and then the necessity of the vaccines, and all of these things. Reasonable people who were subject to the realities of that asymmetry of information couldn't disprove positively the lies at the time, but by saying that they were going to wait until definitive evidence could undercut the narratives being propagated by the people who had the megaphone and had the advantage in that asymmetrical information war, that by deferring to them initially, they were able to get everything, the power centers were able to get everything that they wanted. And by the time the dissidents were proven correct, the damage had already been done. And I think something similar will happen with this case. Now, I think Jeff disagrees with me. He suspects that when the case goes to trial, that it will generate a lot of media attention, and that the lull in interest over the Kirk assassination now, and this is something that happened less than 2 months ago, but you almost don't hear it outside of listening to, say, Candace Owens or some of the other Ian Carroll, some of the other independent media figures who are continuing to make a stink about it. Outside of them, there is virtually no attention at all. There is no corporate media attention on it. There is no governmental attention. And if it wasn't for the few independent, large platform voices talking about it now, it would mostly have faded into the background like so many other cases, so many other bits of current events. Even something as historic as this, I don't think it is hyperbolic to say this is the most high-profile assassination in America since RFK. Probably, maybe this is even more high-profile than that, than Martin Luther King. It's probably not as high profile as MLK or JFK before that, but I would say it's on the same level as RFK, and yet it has effectively not quite been memory hold, but it has 1/100th of the interest that it had just a month ago. And so we'll see if in a year and a half, whenever this ultimately goes to trial, if Robinson doesn't allegedly kill himself before then, and that doesn't necessarily mean that just because he's reported to die that the person who played the role is actually dead, but if it goes to trial in a year and a half, perhaps there will be a lot of evidence that comes back around, or a lot of attention that comes back around to filter through the evidence at that point, and the trial generates a reliving of the moment, and any questions about the official narrative that seem unanswered now will be answered then. Even if that is the case, imagine a situation where it turns out that the official story is not able to be prosecuted successfully, and Tyler Robinson is found not guilty and he's released, and there's a hole in the story. Well, then what? If that's what happened, is there going to be any follow-up to figure out if the Candace Owens objections had any merit? Will there be a push? Will there be the sort of energy that there was that there should have been? There really wasn't that much energy in the aftermath of the assassination. A lot of the centers of influence that conceivably would have challenged the official narrative were remarkably strident in their opposition to any questioning of it, and their assurances that the way things officially were reported is what happened. And so to imagine that, given that that's what took place in the days and weeks after the assassination, that a year and a half down the road, if the officially reported narrative is revealed to be a farce, that there will be some sort of resurgent energy to try to figure out what actually happened. Whereas, in contrast, it's a lot easier to imagine a situation where, even if, for the sake of argument, that the officially reported narrative is revealed dispositively to be total BS in a year and a half, that all of the people who benefit, all the cui bono beneficiaries that Jeff and I identified, that they would not have already totally gotten everything they wanted out of the case, even if it is proven in the future that everything about it was false.
So back to the specific events of September 10th, 2025. We talked about the ballistics, and we both agree that there are some serious questions that need to be answered. The next, I guess, from most compelling to least compelling, the next most compelling, I guess, hole in the official narrative has to do with George Zinn. So George Zinn is a 71-year-old, I've seen him characterized as a gadfly, who supposedly, according to the official narrative, falsely confessed to the shooting, saying that he did it, quote, to draw attention from the real shooter. And he was charged with obstruction, not murder, and then he later faced unrelated child exploitation charges. And so the question, of course, is if the lone shooter theory is correct and that Tyler Robinson was the one who shot Charlie Kirk, why would some random 71-year-old guy falsely confess to having killed Charlie Kirk? I think, number one, false confessions are a real thing. They happen quite frequently. So I don't think a false confession in and of itself is dispositive. And also, if you believe the narrative, this guy was kind of a kook, and he was known for showing up at these kinds of events and making a nuisance of himself. And also the fact that, again, if we're accepting the narrative that he had kiddie porn on his cell phone, it's not that hard to imagine that he's kind of just off his rocker, a crazy old boomer who, for whatever bizarre reason, decided to make a false confession. I don't think that on its own is that hard to believe. But what do you think, Ness?
Well, if he is, when you say that false confessions are a thing that happen, do they happen in the immediate heat of the moment, or are they extracted subsequently?
That's true. Yeah, when I said false confessions happen, I was generally thinking of scenarios. I think the most common scenario would be like once the police have you in the interrogation room after several hours and they kind of break you down and you just will say anything to get out of there, and so you falsely confess. That's fair enough. I guess I'm sure it is. I would think it is a lot less common to have a false confession in these kinds of scenarios where you're not even, before you've even been arrested or accused of anything, you confess to something. That's true. And one other thing I should say in favor of what you're saying, that this pokes holes in the official narrative, there's a concept in the rules of evidence that a statement against interest is given greater weight, meaning that if you're evaluating the veracity of a statement, the fact that the statement hurts the person who said it gives that statement more credibility. So I think that would apply in this case too. Obviously, him confessing to a murder like this is not in his obvious interest, so the fact that he said it gives it more credence.
Yeah, I was thinking the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was famously tortured by the CIA and ended up providing information that was incriminating, but that was false, and he was deeply embedded in Al-Qaeda operations, and even he confessed to something that it is now agreed upon was untrue. In the case of in the case of George Zinn, for him, presumably he the only way that the story as officially reported is truthful is if this guy is totally off his rocker and he's really a lunatic who has some sort of weird death wish. Because if your phone is full of kiddie porn, the idea that you would immediately and ostentatiously confess to a murder in broad daylight and think that even if you were just doing it for kicks and because you wanted to create a distraction or whatever, you would have to have no sense of logical progression of your thoughts to think that you wouldn't immediately be arrested, detained, and then have your devices confiscated. So if you had kiddie porn to go make an ostentatious, clownish display like that and think it's not going to result in this incriminating evidence on your device being discovered by law enforcement, you have no rational faculties at all. And for someone who's a septuagenarian to be unaware of that, again, the only thing that makes sense if the official story is accurate is that this guy was a total lunatic who, despite being a lunatic, had behaved himself perfectly well up until that point. There weren't any stories about him being disruptive or confrontational prior to that. On the other hand, if he is one of the many actors who have very bit pieces of information about the plot and don't know exactly what's going on, but only are told, hey, for the cause, your part is you are going to ostentatiously make these claims after this event happens, but don't worry, you didn't actually do anything, you're just saying words, and so you can't be held accountable, you can't be thrown in jail just because you said words, even if they are words that people find distasteful or potentially even self-incriminating. If there's no truth there, then you have nothing to worry about. I think that is a lot more plausible an explanation for his behavior. But again, I wouldn't completely dismiss that he's just a total lunatic. But again, the problem I have there is if he's a total lunatic, how did he have the conscientiousness to come to this event on time and sit respectfully in the crowd as it progressed, and only at the point in time when Charlie Kirk was shot and a bunch of chaos erupted and people were screaming and running around, only then did you suddenly decide that you were going to say that it was you who did it. That strains my credulity.
If the goal of these conspirators was to pin the blame solely on Tyler Robinson, I have a hard time understanding how George Zinn fits into that at all.
I think, to the contrary, it's important for these audacious actions taken clandestinely to be surrounded by misdirections and things that can be pointed. They can create a general sense of murkiness and muddiness, and the idea that there's a bunch of false things that have been said about this. And if you are just a casual observer to the story, first you hear that it's some old boomer guy who did the killing, and then later, no, it's not him. It was actually a Trans-Tifa guy on the roof. And no, actually, didn't you hear some people say that it was an inside job? And so you have all of these different narratives swirling around, and you have people you have the reporting on the multiple bullet casings saying these different things. And then there is the person who works for Turning Point USA in the chaos that's ensuing immediately after Charlie Kirk's death, going and taking recording equipment. And so you have all of these different bits and pieces of the story that create a general perception that there is a lack of clarity. And if you're not invested in it, then you're not going to be able to get to the bottom of it. And so we have to just wait for the official sources to get the narrative straight for us. In the case of George Zinn, Jeff, you said that you grant that it's not dispositive proof that just because he made the confession that he had anything to do with it. So what do you think his story is? Just that he really is kind of a stark, mad, raving lunatic?
I would want to look into the details more, but yeah, I could, yes, because my understanding is he's known to that area of Utah for coming to public events and making a nuisance of himself and being a generally eccentric character. And to me, the fact that he had kiddie porn on his phone just gives credence to the fact that he is just kind of a lunatic, and there's really no rationality to what he did. So I'm thinking in like Portland, where Antifa probably is its strongest, at least in the United States, whenever they have any sort of public event, it's going to attract a lot of weirdos and eccentric people. And I think George Zinn maybe fits into that type of person, that type of character who just routinely shows up at events and acts in bizarre ways.
Well, this would be a divergence from those standard activist Antifa tactics, because in the other events that they show up for, they are continuously disruptive, and the idea is to shut down the event. What is bizarre here is that up until that point, he was displaying total probity, at least as far as it's been reported. There wasn't any reports of him being disruptive previously or doing anything that these types generally do in events that they're there to sabotage. And for him to be seemingly so evenly keeled until the moment that this chaotic event happens, and then that is the catalyst that triggers him to start yelling. I mean, I guess if he is just totally off his rocker, it's hard to tell exactly what would trigger someone, and maybe he's just responding to whatever level of emotional energy is around him. And so when people were prim and proper and respectful, he was following suit. And then when chaos ensued, he just thought of the most outrageous thing he could say. That's plausible, and I agree that this is not the most compelling piece of evidence to undercut the official narrative, but it is something that is, at the very least, needs some sort of explanation.
Definitely needs some sort of explanation, and ideally he would be put under oath and asked very tough questions and maybe get to the bottom of why he would discover if there's any sort of rhyme or reason to his actions that day. So next piece of evidence that I've seen, and I'm primarily drawing this from listening to several of Candace Owens' episodes. She's the most prominent media personality that I'm aware of that has been pushing back against the official narrative. Jimmy Dore just this week has really been hammering hard on this. He's completely rejecting the official narrative, but she thinks it's important. She believes that an important piece of evidence is of Tyler Robinson at a Dairy Queen hours after the shooting. So assuming that the image or the video still image of Robinson at the Dairy Queen is accurate, or that it really is him. So I guess he was at a Dairy Queen about 6:30 p.m. the day of the shooting. But I honestly, I don't, and maybe I don't mean to straw man this and make it seem like this is a key piece of evidence that the anti-official narrative people are pushing, but she did spend a decent amount of time on it on her podcast. And I still don't really know what, even if it were true that Tyler Robinson went to a Dairy Queen at 6:30 p.m. the day of the shooting, I don't really know what she thinks that proves. So what do you think, Ness?
Well, I won't speak for her, but if this is a coordinated event where various actors are given specific assignments and they're not given full explanation as to why they're doing what they're doing, then him being told to report to this Dairy Queen at this particular period in time makes perfect sense, because then you have video footage and it will immediately bring to mind among those who are aware of the high profile shootings that have occurred recently in American history. It'll bring to mind the Luigi Mangione and the McDonald's, and so it'll say, oh, well, this got to be the guy. This is standard operating procedure. And there are questions about that case too. In his case, though, Mangione, if you take the official story as reported, he had a longer paper trail of an intellectual trajectory that would fit better into the assassination that he is alleged to have committed than in the case of Tyler Robinson. Generally, though, the psychological questions are raised, and in the case of Mangione, it was days after as well, but people aren't going to make that necessary connection. He would have had more time for the adrenaline to wear off and to be able to process what his next moves were. In the case of Tyler Robinson, this is something that just happened hours later, and presumably the manhunt is, well, not presumably, but presumably Tyler Robinson would know because it was still happening. The manhunt was still going on, and so for him to be out in public as opposed to just laying low is very questionable. It's convenient because now here's video footage of him later out in public, so we knew that he didn't, well, the story would be that he didn't know where to go, and so he's just out in public again. That's weird if he has the foreknowledge to know that he has to dispose of the weapon and then come back and get it later. For him to just be sitting out in public after he committed this heinous act is difficult to make sense of if he's acting rationally, but in terms of the context of what has happened in the American context recently with the Mangione shooting, and then also just being able to point to, hey, here's evidence of the guy afterwards, and it looks like the same guy who was on the stairs. It creates this narrative of a lone shooter, but it doesn't seem to mesh with what someone would rationally do after committing an act like that. But it does, again, not to speak for her, but it makes sense in the conception that I am conjecturing about here, where, again, it's specific actors given specific roles and what they need to do. And none of these things, you could sell it to Tyler Robinson. Look, you're not going to be incriminated for anything. You're on a roof, there was a gun, but you didn't actually shoot it. You're just putting it here, okay? And then you're going to a Dairy Queen. Like, again, your life's going to be rough, but you didn't kill anybody, so you don't really have anything to worry about.
Last piece of evidence we're going to talk about are the text messages. The prosecutors have cited text messages allegedly sent by Robinson to his trans lover, admitting the act and expressing motive. And these messages are included in the charging documents. And a lot of online claims are that the texts look scripted. I haven't seen any convincing evidence that they are falsified in any way. And hopefully, again, those text messages will be authenticated. But I guess they struck you as obviously concocted, obviously falseness.
I don't know if I would say definitively that they were obviously false, but they definitely set off a lot of alarm bells for someone who has some experience interacting with people in that age range and the cohort that Tyler Robinson represents, and texting with them back and forth over a regular basis. I've never seen anybody text like that, non-ironically. After telling his roommates to look under his keyboard, Tyler Robinson's roommate realizes that Tyler Robinson is the one, given this text thread being voracious, is the one who committed the act. And this is how Tyler Robinson responds. I am still okay, my love, but am stuck in here for a little while longer yet. Shouldn't be long until I can come home, but I gotta grab my rifle still. To be honest, I had hoped to keep this secret till I died of old age. I am sorry to involve you. I am still okay, my love. Again, that doesn't sound like the kind of text that a 21, 20, early 20-something man would send to a lover. And then later, Tyler Robinson says that when he's talking about retrieving his weapon, that I can get close to it, but there's a squad car parked right by it. Squad car is not the way that average people refer to police cars. They'll talk about cop cars or there's a cop, but a squad car is something maybe you see scripted, perhaps, but if you're not in law enforcement or if you're not in intelligence, that seems like a weird way to speak. It just doesn't mesh with my experience with how people in their early 20s communicate over text. And of course, this is granting the caveat that this is a very extraordinary situation, and so maybe he has some sort of heightened sense of romantic adventure, and so he is speaking more formally and more with more grandiosity than he normally would. And then later on, Tyler Robinson says, after totally incriminating himself and just himself, he instructs his roommate to, quote, delete this exchange, as if someone who undertakes a high-profile assassination, who is steeped in online culture and presumably has some basic understanding of the internet is forever, and that exchanging texts on an iPhone or an Android and just deleting the text as if that makes those things unrecoverable, when earlier he had talked about how he wanted to take this to the grave with him, why he would admit to it via text as opposed to just returning home and talking to his roommate in person, is difficult to make sense of. I think you have to put that all, you have to do a lot of work in this being an extraordinary event department to carry the weight of all of this, what would otherwise be very unusual word choices, and again, the entire idea that you want not to incriminate yourself and you want this to stay secret, but you're sending it very incriminatingly and you're not trying to be coy about it or trying to disguise it in symbolic language, but are just explicitly saying you committed this murder, this thing that will give you the death penalty or put you away for life, but you don't want anyone to find out, so you better delete these text messages. That is, again, it's strange credulity to me. And then the last thing that I am maybe more stuck on than I should be, but I think it meshes well with the idea that this was coordinated by people who are willing to take part in these sort of operations, these planned operations, these choreographed things. They tend to be theater kid types. Tyler Robinson also, in talking to his roommate, says, quote, I worry about prints I had to leave in a bush where I changed outfits, unquote. The word outfit is something I don't think I've ever heard a man in his early 20s talk about. I don't think anybody ever refers to what they're wearing as an outfit. Maybe a mother with a toddler refers to the outfit she's putting on, but I don't think grown men refer to their clothes as outfits. They just talk about them as clothes. I had to change clothes. That is, for every 10,000 times somebody says I have to change clothes, maybe someone says I have to change my outfit, especially among the 20-something male demographic. Hopefully time will offer revelations to replace our conjecture and our speculation, or at the very least will allow us to revisit this time capsule to mock the other one for being incorrect, because I don't think we can't both be correct about it, and I very much doubt that we're both incorrect about it, and so time will tell. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.